A thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ. Mel Gibson went quiet for a moment, then said it like he was confessing something. There is a Bible most of the world has never read. It's older than the one you know. It holds more books. And according to Gibson, what it says about the end times is nothing like what we've been told. What was cut out? Why was it buried? And who decided the rest of us didn't need to know? The Bible most people never seen. You're in another place. You're in another realm. You know, you need to go to hell. You need to go to Sheol. When Mel Gibson started talking publicly about the Ethiopian Bible, most people assumed it was a celebrity drifting into fringe territory. But scholars who actually study these texts had a different reaction. They weren't surprised. They were relieved someone was finally paying attention. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. The Bible most of the Western world considers complete, 66 books fixed and final, is not the only version that survived. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves a Bible with more than 80 books. That's not a minor variation. That's a fundamentally different scriptural universe. Among those extra texts are writings that were once widely circulated in the earliest Christian communities before they vanished from Western tradition. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of the Covenant, the Didascalia. Not fringe documents, not myths, ancient writings that thousands of early Christians treated as sacred until powerful men in Rome decided they were too dangerous to keep. Ethiopia kept them anyway. For nearly 2,000 years, Ethiopian monks copied these texts by hand in remote monasteries perched on cliffs and hidden in highland forests, generation after generation. They weren't doing it as rebellion. They believed these writings were urgent. Messages intended not for their age, but for a generation far in the future. And get this, many of those texts are written in Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian language that only a tiny number of scholars in the world can read today. For centuries, the wider world didn't know what these manuscripts actually said. The language barrier alone kept the contents invisible to Western eyes. That invisibility may have been exactly what saved them. If you want to know what those hidden texts say about the world right now, stay with us. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. What we're about to get into about the 4 stages in the suppressed prophecies has been locked away for nearly 17 centuries. You're going to want to be here for it. How Ethiopia became the guardian of truth. And I'm not wholly sure I can pull it off to tell you the truth. It's really super ambitious. But I'll take a crack at it. To understand why Ethiopia alone preserved these texts, you have to understand what makes this country unlike any other civilization on Earth. Christianity reached Ethiopia in the 4th century, roughly the same time it was spreading across the Roman Empire. But unlike the church in Rome, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church grew in relative isolation. It was never absorbed into the religious and political machinery of Rome. It kept its own calendar, its own traditions, its own version of the scriptures. And when the Council of Nicaea gathered in AD to decide which books would define Christianity for the next 2,000 years, Ethiopia was on a completely different path. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. That council wasn't just a theological meeting. Ethiopian scholars and theologians argue it was a political act. Church leaders aligned with Roman imperial power chose texts that supported a centralized institution-dependent model of faith. Writings that suggested ordinary people, especially the poor and marginalized, could receive divine truth directly. Dangerous. Writings that prophesied corruption spreading inside the church itself. Even more dangerous. So those writings were removed? Quietly, officially. The world was told the canon was complete. Ethiopia never agreed. And because Ethiopia was never colonized, one of the only nations on the African continent to resist full European domination, its ancient traditions were never forcibly overridden. Its monasteries survived. Its language survived. Its scriptures survived. By the 6th century, the explorer Cosmas Indicopleustes was writing about a Christian kingdom where faith was woven into everyday society and where rulers welcomed Christians fleeing persecution elsewhere. They offered safety. They offered a home. They offered freedom without bowing to Rome. And get this, when you are not beholden to the power structures of empire, you don't have to curate your sacred texts according to what empire finds convenient. You keep what you believe is true, all of it. Here's the catch. For most of history, no one in the West was paying attention. Ethiopia's ancient Bible sat in highland monasteries guarded by monks who understood what they were protecting. It wasn't until the modern era that researchers began to seriously engage with these texts and grasp what had been hidden in plain sight for 2 millennia. But what those texts actually say about the final age of humanity, that's the part that stops people cold. What the Ethiopian Bible says about the end times. Now we get to the part that has researchers, theologians, and filmmakers like Mel Gibson paying close attention. I don't know that you can do it in a foreign language because the concepts are too difficult now. So that you may have to resort to the vernacular. Because the Ethiopian Bible's description of the end times is nothing like the version most Western Christians have been given. In the Western tradition, end times prophecy is dramatic. External, wars, plagues, cosmic catastrophes, the rise of a single Antichrist figure, fire from the sky. The book of Revelation frames the end as a sequence of overwhelming external judgments. The Ethiopian texts describe something different, something quieter, something that hits much closer to home. According to the Book of the Covenant, one of the most significant Ethiopian texts outside the Western canon, Jesus spent 40 days after his resurrection speaking with his disciples. During those 40 days, he described what the final age of humanity would actually look like. And what he described was not primarily a sequence of disasters. It was a sequence of spiritual conditions. These leaders, he warned, would use his message to justify the accumulation of power and wealth. They would speak about heaven while pursuing earthly dominance. When his teachings were used to silence the suffering and protect the powerful, he said it was a sign that humanity was approaching a dangerous threshold. Then he turned to the natural world. Earthquakes, rising waters, strange signs in the sky that would leave even wise people confused. But his framing was careful. These events were not punishments. They were signals, like the first contractions before a birth. The earth itself would react to what was coming. And then came a warning that makes modern readers go pale. He said the thing to fear was not the shaking of the ground. The thing to fear was the moment when human hearts grow so cold that nothing moves them anymore. He called it the Great Silence. And what the Ethiopian texts say happens during that silence, that's what we're getting into next. The 4 stages of the final age. It's almost like a magic trick in a sense. It's diversion. It's obfuscate this, show that. When Mel Gibson spoke about the Ethiopian Bible, this is the part researchers believe left him shaken. Because among the most striking passages in the entire collection is a framework Jesus uses to describe the final age in 4 distinct stages. Scholars who have studied these manuscripts say this framework has no equivalent anywhere in the Western biblical canon. It starts slowly, almost invisibly. The first stage is called the Age of Forgetting. This is when humanity gradually stops seeking through slow drift. People stop asking the deep questions. They stop sitting with silence. Truth becomes inconvenient. And inconvenience becomes a reason not to look. No explosion, no announcement, just a quiet fading. The second stage is the Age of Spectacle. This is the part that keeps researchers awake. Noise and entertainment replace wisdom. The capacity for deep thought is drowned in constant stimulation. People become experts at being distracted and strangers to stillness. The text described this not just as a cultural failure, but as a spiritual emergency, a civilization losing its ability to hear anything quieter than the loudest voice in the room. Sound familiar? The third stage is the age of the false shepherd. Here the texts become uncomfortably specific. Corrupt leaders take the name of God and use it as a weapon. These false shepherds don't come from outside the faith. They rise from within it. They speak the language of the sacred while pursuing the rewards of the secular. Jesus describes them as the most dangerous figures in the entire prophecy because they are the hardest to recognize. And then comes the fourth stage, the one that makes scholars go pale. It is called the Great Silence. Not a silence of peace, not the quiet of a holy space. The Great Silence is described as the moment when the connection between heaven and earth grows so thin that even those who are genuinely searching can barely feel it. The texts say this is the most dangerous moment in all of human history. Not because God is absent, because humanity has drifted so far that it can no longer feel the presence that was always there. But here's what the texts say happens next, and it is the last thing anyone expects. The 7 seals of the heart. Well, if you believe that, that's true. Yeah. I don't know. I hope you're right. If you've heard of the 7 seals from the book of Revelation, you know them as cosmic, external events, catastrophic judgments unleashed from outside. The Ethiopian texts describe a completely different set of 7 seals, and this is the part Gibson has said changes how you understand everything else. These seals are not about the world. They are about the interior condition of a single human being. According to these ancient writings, the real battle of the final age is not fought in the sky or on a battlefield. It is fought inside every person alive. The first seal is the seal of comfort. When a person avoids truth simply because it feels uncomfortable, growth requires disruption. This seal chooses safety over inquiry. The second is the seal of pride. When someone becomes so certain they already understand everything that they stop listening, stop learning, stop reflecting. Pride doesn't always look arrogant. Sometimes it looks like quiet certainty, and the texts say it is one of the most effective barriers to awakening. The fifth is the seal of false community. When people surround themselves only with those who agree with them, an echo chamber where real truth can no longer enter. The texts describe this as uniquely dangerous in the final age, a time when it becomes easier than ever to find a tribe that confirms whatever you already believe. The sixth is the seal of false mercy, where forgiveness becomes an excuse to never grow or change. Comfort masquerades as grace, avoiding accountability, masquerades as compassion. And the seventh seal, the one the text call the most dangerous of all, is the seal of religion itself. When sacred words, rituals, and traditions become a mask hiding a lifeless faith. When the performance of belief replaces the reality of it. Here's what the text says happens when a person breaks through all 7. They don't receive a sign from the heavens. They don't unlock a supernatural gift. They themselves become the spark of awakening the world has been waiting for. But how that awakening connects to the prophecy about the final empire, that's where things get truly unsettling. The final empire and the cage nobody sees. Do consult with someone like a biblical scholar. Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. There is another Ethiopian text outside the Western canon called the Didascalia, and this is the part Mel Gibson has described as the most difficult to sit with. It records Jesus warning his followers about what he calls the final empire. Not a nation, not a military power. A system, a structure so vast and so subtle that most people would live inside it their entire lives without ever realizing they were captive. He says this empire will not use chains. It will use comfort. It will give people bread and entertainment and call that freedom. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. This was written down roughly 2,000 years ago, and yet it reads like a description of the present moment with surgical precision. People are not oppressed in ways they can easily identify. They are managed, distracted, given endless options that all lead to the same place. And get this, the illusion of choice the text suggests is the most effective form of control ever devised. Then comes a line that has quietly echoed through centuries of Ethiopian scholarship. Blessed are those who see the cage and still choose love. Blessed are those who are hungry for truth in the age of false abundance. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Jesus says that in the last age, his voice will rise again from unexpected places, from deserts, from prisons, from the children of the forgotten. He says his spirit will speak through those who are ignored by the powerful, not through the institutions, not through the cathedrals, through the ones the powerful dismiss entirely. And then comes the line that Ethiopian scholars say was one of the primary reasons this text was suppressed at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The most dangerous truth of the end times is this: the people who claim to be ready will be the last ones who see it coming. The question Ethiopian monks were sitting with for 2,000 years was not whether this empire would come. They believed it already had. The question was whether there would be anyone left who could see it and still choose differently. That answer arrives in the prophecy they guarded most carefully of all. The prophecy of the final witness. Is that up for debate right now with you? Yeah, it is. I'm thinking like, this is the chapter Mel Gibson's comments pointed toward most directly, and it is the one Ethiopian scholars say was most deliberately suppressed. According to the oldest manuscripts preserved in Ethiopian monasteries, before Jesus ascended, he gave his disciples something the Western Church left out entirely: a final prophecy, a complete and specific vision of the world in its last days. Ethiopian scholars refer to it as the prophecy of the final witness. And what it names as the final witness is not what anyone expected. Not an angel, not a cosmic event, not a supernatural sign visible to all. The final witness, Jesus tells his disciples, is a generation, ordinary people who will rise up in the deepest darkness of the last days and refuse to be silent. He tells his disciples, this generation will not be welcomed by the powerful. They will be mocked, silenced, and erased from the platforms and pulpits of their age. But their voices will be heard where it counts, not in arenas or on screens, in the hearts of the people who are ready to hear them. And then, do not fear if they turn off your voice. Truth does not need a microphone. Here's the catch. Ethiopian theologians argue that the suppression of this prophecy at Nicaea in 325 AD was not accidental. It was deliberate. A prophecy that said the most dangerous false prophets of the end times would wear crosses and build cathedrals was far too threatening for a church that was in the process of building its own cathedrals and accumulating its own power. So, those words were buried, and quiet monks in Ethiopian highland monasteries kept copying them by lamplight, generation after generation, waiting for the moment when the world would be ready to hear what had been taken away. That moment, according to many who have studied these texts closely, may already be here. Why this matters now? Gibson is not a theologian. He is not a historian, but he spent years immersed in early Christianity while making The Passion of the Christ. And what he encountered in the Ethiopian tradition clearly left a mark. When he started speaking publicly about the Ethiopian Bible's description of the end times, the reaction wasn't laughter. It was a wide surge of people asking, why haven't we heard this before? The answer is not mysterious. It is deliberate. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, one of the foremost scholars of Ethiopian religious texts and a translator of the Book of Enoch, has described these writings as containing a prophetic consciousness unlike anything in the Western canon. He and other Ethiopian scholars point to the interior framing of the end times as the defining difference. This is not a prophecy about external events happening to passive people. It is a prophecy about a spiritual condition unfolding inside every human heart, individually and collectively, all at once. And get this, that distinction changes everything. If the end times are primarily an external catastrophe, not unsettling like a horror film, unsettling, like understanding something you've been sensing for years, but couldn't name, the Ethiopian Bible does not end its prophecy in despair. It ends with a promise that cuts straight through the darkness. Jesus says, the end is not the end of life, it is the end of the lie. He promises that those who chose love and truth, even when the whole world chose comfort and power, will not be lost. He says they will be known by their scars, not their crowns. For 2,000 years, Ethiopia guarded those words. Monks with ink-stained hands copying ancient Ge'ez letters by lamplight, convinced that one day a generation would come ready to hear what had been preserved for them. Maybe that generation is the one watching right now. If this opens something in you, hit the like button and subscribe. There is far more buried history to explore, and we are just getting started.